As I said, ideally we'd have some more points established here, which would allow me to, with more confidence, connect the dots. Since I know my dots can move, however, without needing to worry about what's around them, I'm not sweating it too much. The dots I'd like to connect are profile to outside corner and profile to inside corner. Essentially, the central parts of the sculpture needs to be connected to points that are further out from the central part. What we drew around the central axis of the eye, if you will. However, we need to be flexible at this moment in time. Perhaps we need to change something or make an adjustment to something. That's not even a perhaps, to be honest with you. That much is almost certain. It always happens. So to make sure this is possible, we're going to work slow and not reach the profile with the clay we used to travel out and down or in with. We'll stay slightly behind the profile. Normally we do this so that we can always, with ease, bring the profile down a bit. Since we have context around the eye in a regular portrait sculpture, we can't just continue to build the profile out forever. There are things around the eye to consider, of course. You can't bring the eye further forward than, say, the profile of the nose from the side view, for example. Here we can do just that, which is freeing, of course, but I'm going to treat this like it's not the case, or less of the case, let's say, and give myself a little bit of room to move the profile itself, both in and out, even though I'm most likely going to move it out. Another way we're going to maintain a sense of flexibility and the ability to make sweeping changes to our sculpture, should we need to, is going to be by not adding a lot of volume. If we observe from below, we can get an insight into the volume of the upper lid, for example. We can see how it turns from the apex at the profile down to the outside corner. This red line is the volume which we will eventually be looking to make. Currently, however, this amount of volume simply makes the piece less flexible, which we don't need at the moment. A lack of volume is at the moment going to benefit us greatly in terms of making changes faster. Less clay needing to move whenever a change needs to be made means we're more flexible to, say, move the outside corner of the eye, for example. Move anything, really. So this red line here represents better how I currently aim to connect the dots, or the volume that I'm after. From the front, I can get a very accurately drawn version of this line without needing all the volume. This means I can confirm the accuracy of my drawing from the front without having the cumbersome clay to represent the full volume present in case I need to make a change. And this is a huge benefit. I reserve the addition of the full volume for much later on in the process. Staying flexible brings me to an important point. We've mentioned context. Context matters, as without proper context, the work starts appearing really abstract and it becomes hard to compare to your reference. The same thing is true when it comes to staying flexible. If staying flexible means the work gets really abstract looking, you will have a hard time comparing your sculpture to the reference, and progress becomes tough to come by. To avoid this, always err on the side of representing your subject, not misrepresenting it. This can be very hard to balance out, and everyone has a slightly different version of this as well. Some are more capable of dealing with their work well when it's really abstract, and some struggle greatly with this. You have to find your own balance, but it does take practice to look at your own work and know what to look for. So try to work with your piece in a more abstract stage, more abstract than you are comfortable with, let's say, and don't sell your abilities to do so short. It does take time to get good at, and it does take practice. For example, if I have no volume present in my work, it tends to make the work look too weird for my taste, too robotic and flat. So while I underplay the amount of volume added as I build the piece up, I still want some sense of roundness or volume there. Otherwise, it's simply too hard for me to do good work. If something is meant to be somewhat soft, don't make it angular like a machine, and vice versa, of course. The eye is round and soft, and so some volume is going to be needed to keep it from looking like something completely different than what it is. Usually I find that volume gets underplayed anyways, and our work ends up somewhat too flat. It's a common mistake amongst many students, including myself. Knowing this allows you to get away with adding some volume, knowing you'll need a lot more than you think anyways. Anticipation is key here, of course, and being able to anticipate comes from having done it many times. So there is never a substitute for experience. Since sculpture is about occupying space, I do like to work from the center out. We don't have any limits, like paper size, framing us in here when it comes to sculpture. Of course, that's not entirely true, since I've created some boundaries I won't go beyond unless I purposefully change them with intent, like the profile, for example, and the size of my board, let's say. But as a general statement, this is true. I work from the center of the eye out and from the profile out, since I know more or less not to go beyond the profile. Partially I know this, since I know I can't observe depths from the front view, which we're currently working from. Always considering what you can and can't observe, and only work on the things you can observe, not something you can't observe, of course. I use a center-out approach in figure sculpture as well. Here I start with the core of the body being the pelvis and the ribcage and work outwards from there. The proportions established in the box and the egg, or the ribcage and the pelvis, ends up dictating the proportions of the whole sculpture, the whole figure. Sometimes there are other things that I have to consider as well, of course. Sometimes the height I have available to me in the armature is going to limit me, but this statement still holds true with some more nuances added on top. It's more of a philosophical thing, perhaps, and there are always stuff standing in the way of a sweeping statement such as this. But in sculpture, I think it can be good to consider this, and not work from the outside in at least, even if there are things to consider out there at the fringes when taking the center-out approach. I work pretty slow. If you want accuracy and fidelity to your subject to be part of what you do, then working slow is almost a necessity. At the same time, working slow means less mistakes and less back and forth. Slow is smooth and smooth is fast, after all. If you add too much clay at once, it's easy to lose track of your drawing to an extent where it's tough to find it again, for example. If you spent any time drawing, you want to retain the good work that you did and build on top of it, not bury it and lose it and have to do it again. That's a waste of time, of course, and wasting time slows you down even more. Notice how I'm also not freaking out because the sculpture looks really weird at the moment. The sculpture looks flat out bad at the moment, but I'm plugging away at it, working it up slowly over time. I can stay calm in these moments because I know what questions to ask myself about my sculpture as I progress it. The questions that I haven't asked yet, those are of no concern to me right now. The questions that I have asked, I feel confident about the answers that I've found. Since I try to work by asking the appropriate question at the appropriate time, I'm not overburdening myself with too much doubt. I don't have 10 balls in the air juggling them all at the same time. I got 2 or 3, and this is much more manageable. Experience has taught me that the sculpture comes together slowly and by chipping away at it, by being deliberate and asking one question at a time and then answering that question. If I do that, I can get the work done to a decent degree. At the end, the sculpture will look like something, even if it doesn't look like something right now. Patience with yourself, patience with the process, these are things we have to practice and cultivate. The way in which you apply clay is something that often gets talked about as a technique, and I think it's more of a mindset type of thing. It's not as specific as a technique, if you will. I have some simple guidelines that I try to follow, but I'm sure that I break the rules that I set for myself all the time. Either way, here are some of those guidelines for you to follow as well if you want. The clay application, the pieces of clay that I apply should follow the forms. This is contrary to later rendering techniques where I work against the form. But when the forms are being built, we're adding clay with the forms. This creates rhythm and movement and helps a rougher surface communicate to me what is happening on it, essentially making the piece much less confusing to look at. I try to think of sculpture as language, even in progress sculpture, and this means that my sculpture has to communicate with me in some fashion or another. Making sure that the way the clay is applied is descriptive then makes a lot of sense. I try to be efficient as well, so the size of the clay piece that's applied is in line with how big the mark I'm trying to make is. Bigger and broader regions of the sculpture gets a broader treatment with bigger pieces of clay. Smaller areas get smaller pieces of clay which are capable of describing more intricate information. It's all about what I'm trying to say, in other words.